In 1932, American families made 30 dinners. America had never eaten this way before. Ramen noodles boiling in dented pots. Velveeta melting over diced potatoes. Children ate them every single night. Then the economy recovered. Grocery stores are filled with choices. Frozen dinners replaced homemade meals. One by one, the recipes stopped, and nobody knew where these 30 genius poor man's dinners would change how you cook forever. Ramen noodles were the poverty dinner that fed an entire generation of broke Americans from the 1980s forward. Momofuku Ando invented instant ramen in Japan in 1958, but it did not reach American grocery stores until 1970 when Nissin introduced Top Ramen for 25 cents a package. By 1980, college students, single mothers, and working poor families discovered that a brick of dried noodles and a foil seasoning packet could become dinner in exactly 3 minutes. You boiled 2 cups of water in a small pot. You dropped in the noodle block and stirred until the brick broke apart. You tore open the seasoning packet and dumped the salty powder into the broth. 3 minutes later, you had a steaming bowl of salty, starchy soup that cost 11 cents. One case of 24 packages cost $2.64 in 1985. That was 24 dinners for under $3. Families ate ramen 5 nights a week during the 1980s recession. Kids added hot sauce or a raw egg cracked directly into the boiling broth. Adults ate it straight from the pot to save dishes. Ramen kept millions of people fed when paychecks ran short. It still does. Today, one package costs 39 cents. The recipe has not changed in 50 years. Velveeta Potato Bake was the casserole that made poverty taste like comfort food across American kitchens from the 1960s through the 1990s. Kraft introduced Velveeta processed cheese in 1928, but it became a staple of broke households during the 1960s when a 2-pound block cost 89 cents and lasted 2 weeks. Mothers peeled and diced 6 russet potatoes into half-inch cubes. They layered the raw potatoes in a greased 9 by 13-inch baking dish. They cut Velveeta into cubes and scattered the bright orange cheese across the potatoes. They poured 1 cup of whole milk over everything. The dish baked at 350 degrees for 1 hour until the potatoes softened and the cheese melted into a thick, creamy sauce. The top turned golden and slightly crispy. The smell filled every room in the house. Kids fought over the corner pieces where the cheese caramelized into chewy bits. The entire casserole cost $1.30 in 1975 and fed a family of 6. Mothers made it every Sunday after church. Leftovers reheated perfectly in the oven the next day. Velveeta Potato Bake tasted like wealth even when made from the cheapest ingredients in the store. It proved that processed cheese could turn poverty into something worth celebrating. Beans and cornbread were the survival meal of the rural South from the 1800s straight through the 1980s recession. 1 pound of dried pinto beans cost 19 cents in 1935 and fed 8 people. Mothers soaked the beans overnight in a large pot of cold water. The next morning, they drained the beans and covered them with fresh water. They added a chopped onion, 2 cloves of garlic, salt, and black pepper. The beans simmered on low heat for 4 hours until they broke apart into a thick, earthy broth. Meanwhile, mothers mixed cornmeal, buttermilk, an egg, and a pinch of salt to make cornbread batter. They poured the batter into a greased cast iron skillet and baked it at 400 degrees for 20 minutes. The cornbread came out golden with crispy edges. Families ate the beans in bowls with a thick square of cornbread on the side. You broke off pieces of cornbread and used them to soak up the bean broth. The meal cost less than 50 cents total. It filled stomachs completely. Appalachian families ate beans and cornbread 3 times a week for decades. The dish represented survival, tradition, and the refusal to go hungry. It still tastes like home to anyone who grew up poor in the South. Before we continue, tuna noodle casserole was the weeknight savior of American mothers from 1930 through 1990. A 6-ounce can of chicken of the sea tuna cost 29 cents in 1955. Campbell's cream of mushroom soup cost 12 cents. A box of egg noodles cost 15 cents. For 56 cents, a mother could feed 5 people a hot dinner that looked like effort. She boiled the egg noodles in salted water for 8 minutes and drained them. She opened 2 cans of cream of mushroom soup and stirred in half a cup of milk to thin the sauce. She drained 2 cans of tuna and flaked the fish into chunks with a fork. She mixed the noodles, soup, tuna, and a cup of frozen peas in a large bowl. Everything went into a greased casserole dish. She crushed a handful of potato chips and sprinkled them across the top. The dish baked at 350 degrees for 30 minutes until the edges bubbled and the chips turned golden. The casserole came out creamy, salty, and surprisingly satisfying. It tasted like middle-class comfort food, even though it was made from canned goods. Children ate it without complaining. Adults felt like they had cooked a real meal. Tuna noodle casserole was the lie that made poverty feel normal. Many of you have been asking where to find these recipes. We've gathered hundreds of them from the Depression era through the 1970s in our cookbook, Grandma's Kitchen. Complete instructions, pro tips in 10 chapters. Link is in the description below. Now, let's get back to the video. American goulash was the one-pot dinner that stretched 1 pound of ground beef into 8 servings from the 1920s through the 1980s. This dish had nothing to do with Hungarian goulash. It was a Depression-era invention designed to make cheap meat go further. Mothers browned 1 pound of ground beef in a large pot with a diced onion and 2 cloves of minced garlic. They broke the meat into tiny crumbles so it looked like more. They poured in 1 can of tomato sauce, 1 can of diced tomatoes, and 2 cups of water. They added 2 cups of uncooked elbow macaroni directly into the pot. The macaroni cooked in the tomato broth for 12 minutes, absorbing the liquid and thickening into a rich, beefy sauce. Mothers seasoned it with salt, pepper, and a teaspoon of dried oregano. The whole pot cost $1.40 in 1960 and fed 8 people. Kids called it goulash, adults called it survival. The dish required 1 pot, 15 minutes of active cooking, and ingredients that never went bad. Families ate it twice a week during hard times. It reheated perfectly for 3 days. American goulash proved that poverty cooking could still taste like a home-cooked meal. Rehook, 5 dinners survived the Depression. 25 more fed families through every recession after. Each one cost under $1. Each one stretched cheap ingredients into full meals. Mothers made them without shame. Children ate them without knowing they were poor. These meals were not just food. They were survival engineering built by families who refused to starve. Hamburger gravy on toast was the military breakfast that became a poverty dinner for working-class families from 1910 through 1990. The United States Army called it SOS, which stood for a phrase polite people did not say out loud. Soldiers ate it in mess halls during both World Wars. Veterans brought the recipe home and fed it to their families when money was tight. You browned half a pound of ground beef in a cast-iron skillet over medium-high heat. You crumbled the meat into tiny pieces as small as peas. You sprinkled 3 tablespoons of flour over the cooked meat and stirred for 1 full minute to cook the raw flour taste out. You slowly poured in 2 cups of whole milk while stirring constantly to prevent lumps. The mixture thickened into a creamy, peppery gravy. You seasoned it heavily with black pepper and salt. You toasted 4 slices of white bread and ladled the gravy over the top. The meal cost 43 cents in 1950 and fed 4 people. Fathers made it on Saturday mornings when mothers worked the early shift. Kids ate it for dinner when paychecks did not stretch far enough. The gravy was thick, salty, and filling enough to quiet hungry stomachs until the next meal. Creamed peas on toast were the Depression-era dinner that turned a 15-cent can of peas into something that felt like a meal. Grandmothers made this dish from 1930 through 1960, when meat was either too expensive or unavailable due to wartime rationing. You melted 3 tablespoons of butter in a small saucepan over medium heat. You whisked in 3 tablespoons of flour and stirred for 1 full minute to create a roux. You slowly poured in 1½ cups of whole milk while whisking constantly. The mixture thickened into a smooth white sauce. You opened a can of Lesueur baby peas and dumped the entire contents, including the liquid, into the sauce. The canning liquid was already salted and added flavor. You stirred until everything was hot and creamy. You toasted 2 slices of white bread and buttered them. You ladled the creamed peas over the toast and served it immediately. The meal cost 28 cents in 1945 and fed 2 people. Mothers made it on Fridays during Lent when Catholics could not eat meat. Children ate it after school when nothing else was in the cupboard. The dish was simple, filling, and required only 3 ingredients. Creamed peas on toast kept families fed through the hardest years of American history. Cabbage and noodle skillet was the Eastern European poverty meal that fed immigrant families in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan from 1880 through 1980. A head of green cabbage cost 7 cents in 1940. A box of egg noodles cost 10 cents. For 17 cents, a Polish or Slovak grandmother could feed 6 people a hot dinner. She shredded half a head of cabbage into thin strips using a sharp knife. She melted 4 tablespoons of butter in a large cast-iron skillet over low heat. She added the shredded cabbage and 1 chopped onion. She cooked the mixture slowly for 25 minutes, stirring occasionally until the cabbage turned golden brown and sweet. Meanwhile, she boiled half a pound of egg noodles in salted water for 8 minutes. She drained the noodles and dumped them directly into the skillet with the caramelized cabbage. She tossed everything together and seasoned heavily with salt and black pepper. The dish came out sweet, buttery, and surprisingly rich. Families ate it straight from the skillet with a spoon. The cabbage sweetness balanced the buttery noodles. The meal cost under 50 cents and filled everyone completely. Polish grandmothers made this 3 times a week during the Depression and never apologized for serving it. Salmon patties from a can were the Friday dinner that made poverty taste like seafood from the 1930s through the 1970s. A 15-ounce can of pink salmon cost 49 cents in 1960, cheaper than ground beef and full of protein. Catholic families ate salmon patties every Friday during Lent when meat was forbidden. Poor families ate them because canned salmon stretched further than fresh fish. You drained a can of pink salmon and dumped it into a bowl. You mashed the fish with a fork, bones and all, because the soft bones provided calcium. You stirred in 1 beaten egg, half a cup of crushed saltine crackers, 1 tablespoon of minced onion, and black pepper. You shaped the mixture into 6 flat patties with your hands. You fried the patties in 1/4 inch of hot oil for 3 minutes on each side until they turned golden brown and crispy. The patties came out crunchy on the outside and soft inside. They tasted fishy, but not unpleasant. Mothers served them with a slice of lemon and a spoonful of mayonnaise mixed with sweet pickle relish. The meal cost 87 cents and fed 5 people. Salmon patties were proof that canned fish could pass as a real dinner when nothing else was available. Cornbread and milk was the Southern bedtime snack that doubled as dinner when money ran out before the end of the month. Families in Appalachia, the Deep South, and the Ozarks ate this combination from the 1800s through the 1980s. You baked a skillet of cornbread in the afternoon using cornmeal, buttermilk, an egg, and lard. By evening, the cornbread was day-old and slightly stale. You broke off a large piece of cornbread and crumbled it into a drinking glass or a bowl. You poured cold whole milk over the cornbread until it was covered. You let it sit for 1 minute so the cornbread absorbed the milk and softened. You ate it with a spoon like cereal. The cornbread turned sweet and creamy from the milk. The texture was soft and comforting. Some families used buttermilk instead of sweet milk for a tangy flavor. Others added a spoonful of sugar or honey. The snack cost less than 10 cents. It filled stomachs before bed. Grandfathers ate it after working the late shift. Children ate it when supper had been too small. Cornbread and milk was not fancy, but it was honest food that kept people from going to bed hungry. That mattered more than taste. Hoover stew was the Depression-era soup named as an insult to President Herbert Hoover, who Americans blamed for the economic collapse of 1929. Families living in shanty towns called Hoovervilles ate this stew in soup kitchens from 1931 through 1935, when free meals were the only thing standing between survival and starvation. The recipe was designed by charity kitchens to stretch minimal ingredients into maximum servings. You boiled 1 pound of elbow macaroni in a large pot of salted water for 8 minutes and drained it. You returned the macaroni to the pot and added 2 cans of stewed tomatoes with their juice, 1 can of corn with liquid, and 4 hot dogs sliced into coins. Everything simmered together for 10 minutes until hot. You seasoned it with salt, pepper, and whatever dried herbs were available. The stew came out thick, tomatoey, and filling. It tasted like survival. 1 pot cost 37 cents in 1932 and fed 12 people. Soup kitchens served it 3 times a week because the ingredients were donated by churches and grocers who could not sell dented cans. Families who ate Hoover stew never forgot the name or the shame of standing in line for free food, but they also never forgot that it kept them alive. The hot dogs floated in the tomato broth like life rafts. The macaroni soaked up the liquid and swelled. The corn added sweetness to balance the acidity. Hoover stew was not delicious, but it was enough. And during the Depression, enough was everything. The recipe disappeared after World War II, when jobs returned and shame replaced hunger. Poor man's meal was the fried dinner that Clara Canucchiari made famous on YouTube before she died at age 98 in 2013. Clara grew up during the Great Depression in upstate New York, and she cooked this meal every week for 70 years. Her YouTube channel, Great Depression Cooking, introduced millions of viewers to recipes their grandmothers never wrote down. This was her signature dish. You peeled 4 russet potatoes and diced them into half-inch cubes. You heated 3 tablespoons of cooking oil in a large cast-iron skillet over medium-high heat. You added the potatoes and fried them without stirring for 5 minutes so they developed a golden crust on the bottom. You flipped the potatoes and fried another 5 minutes. You added 1 diced onion and cooked until the onion softened and turned translucent. You sliced 3 hot dogs into coins and added them to the skillet for the last 3 minutes just to heat through. You seasoned everything heavily with salt and black pepper. The potatoes came out crispy on the outside and soft inside. The onions added sweetness. The hot dogs provided salty, smoky flavor. Liver and onions with brown gravy was the dinner children hated, and mothers insisted on serving from 1930 through 1975 because beef liver was the cheapest meat at the butcher counter and packed more nutrition than steak. 1 pound of beef liver cost 19 cents in 1950 compared to 89 cents for ground beef. Doctors in the 1950s prescribed liver to anemic mothers, tired factory workers, and growing children because it contained more iron and vitamin B12 than any other food. Mothers soaked liver slices in whole milk for 1 hour to remove the bitter taste and make the meat tender. They drained the liver and patted it dry with paper towels. They dredged each slice in seasoned flour. They fried the liver in bacon grease for exactly 2 minutes per side over high heat. Cooking liver longer than 4 minutes total turned it into shoe leather. They removed the liver from the pan and cooked 2 sliced onions in the same grease until they caramelized into dark, sweet ribbons. They poured 1 cup of beef broth into the pan and scraped up the brown bits stuck to the bottom. The broth thickened into a rich gravy. They served the liver smothered in onions and gravy. Depression spaghetti was the Italian dinner poor families made when they had no money for tomato sauce or marinara. Mothers discovered that Heinz ketchup contained tomatoes, vinegar, and sugar, which were the 3 main ingredients in spaghetti sauce. A bottle of ketchup cost 12 cents in 1935. A box of spaghetti cost 8 cents. For 20 cents, a mother could feed 6 people a hot meal that looked like real Italian food. You boiled 1 pound of spaghetti in salted water for 10 minutes and drained it. You returned the spaghetti to the pot and stirred in half a bottle of ketchup until every strand was coated red. You added 2 tablespoons of butter to make it creamy. Some families sprinkled Parmesan cheese on top if they had it. Most did not. The spaghetti tasted sweet, tangy, and nothing like authentic marinara, but children ate it without complaining because the ketchup made it familiar. Depression spaghetti was not a joke or a dare. It was a legitimate survival meal that millions of American families ate weekly from 1930 through 1945. Japanese American soldiers stationed in Japan after World War II introduced ketchup spaghetti to Tokyo, where it evolved into Neapolitan, a dish still served in Japanese cafes today. Milk toast was the sick-room food mothers made for feverish children and exhausted husbands from 1900 through 1960. This was not breakfast. This was medicine disguised as food. When a child was too sick to eat solid meals, mothers made milk toast because the warm milk and soft bread settled upset stomachs and provided calories without demanding digestion. You toasted 2 slices of stale white bread until golden brown. You placed the toast in a wide, shallow bowl. You heated 1 cup of whole milk in a small saucepan until it steamed but did not boil. You spread butter on the hot toast so it melted into every pore. You sprinkled white sugar and a pinch of nutmeg over the butter. You poured the hot milk over the toast until it was submerged. You let it sit for 1 minute so the bread absorbed the milk and softened into a spoonable mush. You ate it with a spoon while it was still warm. The toast tasted sweet, creamy, and comforting. The milk provided protein and fat. The bread provided carbohydrates. The sugar provided quick energy. Mothers made milk toast for sick children at midnight when fevers spiked. Fathers ate it after pulling double shifts at the factory when they were too tired to chew solid food. 15 poverty dinners disappeared from American tables. 15 more vanished just as fast. Each one stretched pennies into full meals. Each one fed families through the worst economic collapse in history. Mothers cooked them without shame. Children ate them without knowing they were survival food. These meals were not recipes. They were lifelines built from nothing. Peanut butter and onion sandwich was the Depression-era lunch that sounds disgusting until you understand that peanut butter was considered a cheap source of protein and raw onions provided vitamin C when fresh fruit was unaffordable. Food writer James Beard documented this sandwich in his writings about American Depression cooking. Newspapers in the 1930s printed recipes recommending peanut butter and onion combinations as a way to get complete nutrition for under 5 cents. You spread 2 tablespoons of peanut butter on white bread in a thick, even layer. You sliced a yellow onion paper thin using a sharp knife. You laid 4 to 6 onion rings across the peanut butter. You sprinkled a pinch of salt over the onions. You pressed a second slice of bread on top. The sandwich was eaten immediately while the onion was still crisp and sharp. The peanut butter was creamy and slightly sweet. The onion was pungent and crunchy. The salt made everything taste more like food and less like desperation. Fried saltines were the late-night snack broke people made when the pantry was empty except for a sleeve of crackers and a tablespoon of cooking oil. This was not a recipe anyone wrote down. It was a desperation trick passed between roommates, night shift workers, and anyone who had ever been hungry at midnight with nothing but saltines in the cupboard. You heated 1 tablespoon of vegetable oil in a small skillet over medium-high heat. You laid 6 saltine crackers flat in the hot oil. You fried them for 30 seconds per side until they puffed slightly and turned golden brown. You removed them to a paper towel and sprinkled them immediately with salt, black pepper, or garlic powder. The crackers came out hot, crispy, and tasting like fried bread. The oil soaked into the crackers and made them rich. They were addictively crunchy and salty. You ate all 6 within 2 minutes, standing at the stove. The snack cost less than 10 cents. It required 1 pan and 90 seconds total. Fried saltines were the food of third-shift factory workers who came home at 2 in the morning, too tired to cook, but too hungry to sleep. Egg salad sandwiches were the cold lunch working-class mothers packed for their children and husbands from 1920 through 1980 because eggs were cheaper than deli meat and did not require refrigeration for several hours. A dozen eggs cost 28 cents in 1950. 1 dozen eggs made enough egg salad for 8 sandwiches. The math was simple: 3.5 cents per sandwich. Mothers boiled 6 eggs in a pot of water for 12 minutes. They drained the eggs and ran them under cold water to stop the cooking. They peeled the eggs and mashed them in a bowl with a fork until they broke into small chunks. They stirred in 3 tablespoons of mayonnaise, 1 teaspoon of yellow mustard, salt, and black pepper. Some mothers added a spoonful of sweet pickle relish. The egg salad was creamy, tangy, and slightly sweet. Mothers spread the egg salad on white bread and cut the sandwiches diagonally. They wrapped each sandwich in wax paper. Shepherd's pie was the casserole that turned yesterday's leftovers into tonight's dinner for British and American working-class families from 1800 through 1980. The name came from sheep herders who made the dish using leftover lamb, but poor American families used whatever meat scraps they had, usually ground beef. The genius of shepherd's pie was that it disguised leftovers as a fresh meal. You browned 1 pound of ground beef in a skillet with a diced onion and 2 cloves of minced garlic. You drained the grease. You stirred in 1 cup of frozen mixed vegetables, peas, carrots, corn, whatever was in the freezer. You added half a cup of beef gravy or beef broth to make the mixture saucy. You poured the meat mixture into a greased casserole dish and spread it evenly. Meanwhile, you boiled 4 peeled potatoes until fork tender. You mashed the potatoes with butter, milk, salt, and pepper until smooth and creamy. Cornmeal mush fried in lard was the Pennsylvania Dutch breakfast that fed German immigrant families from 1850 through 1960. Cornmeal was cheaper than wheat flour throughout American history, and mush was the way poor families stretched 1 cup of cornmeal into multiple meals across 2 days. You boiled 4 cups of salted water in a large pot. You slowly whisked in 1 cup of yellow cornmeal while stirring constantly to prevent lumps. The mixture thickened into a porridge. You cooked it over low heat for 15 minutes, stirring frequently until it pulled away from the sides of the pot. You poured the hot mush into a greased loaf pan and smoothed the top. The mush cooled at room temperature for 1 hour, then went into the ice box overnight. By morning, the mush had solidified into a firm, sliceable loaf. You turned the loaf out onto a cutting board and sliced it 1/2 inch thick. You melted 1 tablespoon of lard in a cast-iron skillet over medium-high heat. You fried the mush slices for 4 minutes per side until they developed a dark, crispy crust. The outside was crunchy and golden. The inside was soft and creamy. 20 poverty meals disappeared. 10 more vanished just as quickly. Each one was made from scraps, leftovers, or the cheapest ingredients at the store. Mothers cooked them with pride. Families ate them without complaint. These dinners were proof that hunger could be defeated with nothing but creativity, patience, and a hot stove. Mock apple pie from Ritz crackers. was the Depression-era dessert that proved Americans could fake luxury when they could not afford the real thing. Nabisco introduced Ritz crackers on November 21, 1934, at 19 cents per pound during the worst years of the Great Depression. The crackers became an instant bestseller because they tasted rich and buttery despite being affordable. Within 3 years, Ritz was the best-selling cracker in America. By 1935, Nabisco started printing a recipe for mock apple pie on the back of every blue box because fresh apples cost too much for most families. The recipe was simple chemical deception. You broke 36 Ritz crackers into pieces and spread them in an unbaked pie shell. You boiled 2 cups of water with 1½ cups of sugar, 2 teaspoons of cream of tartar, and the juice of 1 lemon for 15 minutes. The hot syrup poured over the crackers soaked them until they softened into something resembling cooked apples. You dotted the top with butter, sprinkled cinnamon and nutmeg over everything, and covered it with a top crust. Water pie was the Depression-era miracle that turned plain water into custard through nothing but heat, chemistry, and desperation. The recipe first appeared in print in 1886 in a California newspaper, but it came roaring back during the 1930s when eggs, milk, and butter were either too expensive or completely unavailable due to economic collapse and drought. Mothers made water pie when they had literally nothing else to serve for dessert but still needed to feed guests or celebrate a child's birthday. The recipe seemed impossible. You whisked together 1½ cups of cold water, 1 cup of white sugar, 4 tablespoons of flour, 4 tablespoons of butter cut into small pieces, and 2 teaspoons of vanilla extract in a bowl. You poured this thin, watery mixture into an unbaked pie shell. The liquid looked like flavored water. Nothing about it suggested it would become edible. You baked it at 375 degrees for 1 hour without opening the oven door. What happened inside the oven was pure chemistry. The flour molecules absorbed the water and swelled. The sugar dissolved completely and bonded with the water molecules to form a syrup. The butter melted and floated to the top, creating a golden layer of fat. The heat caused the flour and sugar to gelatinize the water into a thick, custard-like filling. But it worked. Tomato soup cake was the Depression-era dessert that used a can of Campbell's condensed tomato soup as a substitute for eggs, milk, and butter. The recipe first appeared in community cookbooks around 1928, but Campbell's Soup Company did not officially endorse it until the 1960s when they started printing the recipe on soup can labels. The cake was born from necessity when dairy products became too expensive during the late 1920s agricultural depression that preceded the stock market crash. Home cooks discovered that tomato soup contained enough liquid, fat, and acidity to make a cake rise and stay moist without traditional ingredients. The recipe was shockingly simple. You dumped 1 can of Campbell's condensed tomato soup directly into a mixing bowl. You added 1½ cups of flour, 1 cup of sugar, 2 teaspoons of baking soda, 1 teaspoon of cinnamon, ½ a teaspoon of ground cloves, ½ a teaspoon of nutmeg, and ½ a teaspoon of salt. You stirred everything together until smooth. You poured the thick, orange-red batter into a greased 9-inch cake pan. The cake baked at 350 degrees for 35 minutes. What came out of the oven looked like a normal spice cake with a deep reddish-brown color. The cake smelled like cinnamon, cloves, and warm spices. It did not smell like tomatoes at all. The tomato flavor disappeared completely during baking, leaving behind only moisture and a subtle tanginess that made the spices taste brighter. The texture was dense and moist, almost like a gingerbread cake. Porcupine meatballs were the Depression-era dinner that stretched 1 pound of ground beef into 8 servings by mixing raw rice directly into the meat before cooking. The name came from the way the rice poked out of the meatballs like porcupine quills after cooking. This was not cute. This was desperation engineering designed to make expensive meat go further when families could not afford to eat beef more than once a week. The recipe appeared in community cookbooks during the 1930s and remained a staple of broke households through the 1970s. You mixed 1 pound of ground beef with 1 cup of uncooked long-grain white rice, 1 beaten egg, 1 diced onion, salt and pepper in a large bowl. You shaped the mixture into golf ball-sized meatballs with your hands. The meatballs felt fragile and loose because the raw rice had not absorbed any liquid yet. You placed them carefully in a large skillet or Dutch oven. You poured 2 cans of tomato soup mixed with 1 can of water over the meatballs. You covered the pot and simmered over low heat for 1 hour without lifting the lid. During that hour, the rice absorbed the tomato liquid and cooked inside the meatballs, swelling and pushing through the surface. The meatballs expanded to nearly double their original size. Oatmeal patties were the breakfast made from leftover morning oatmeal that mothers fried into crispy cakes to avoid wasting food. This was not a recipe anyone invented on purpose. It was an accident born from the universal rule of Depression-era kitchens: nothing gets thrown away, ever. Mothers cooked oatmeal for breakfast every morning because rolled oats cost 9 cents per pound in 1935, and 1 cup of dry oats fed 4 people. But children often did not finish their bowls. Adults sometimes left portions uneaten. Instead of scraping the leftover oatmeal into the trash, mothers stored it in the icebox until evening. By then, the oatmeal had cooled and congealed into a solid, moldable mass. You scooped the cold oatmeal into your hands and shaped it into patties like hamburgers. Some mothers mixed in a beaten egg to help bind the oatmeal. Others added a spoonful of flour. Most just shaped the cold oatmeal as is. You heated a tablespoon of bacon grease or lard in a cast iron skillet over medium-high heat. You placed the oatmeal patties in the hot fat and fried them for 3 minutes per side until they developed a dark, crispy crust. 25 poverty dinners survived the Depression. 5 more fed families through every recession after. Each one stretched nothing into something. Each one turned scraps into meals. Mothers cooked them without recipes. Daughters learned by watching. These dinners were not food. They were survival tactics built in kitchens by women who refused to let their families starve. Peanut butter bread pudding was the Depression-era dessert mothers made when every sweet thing in the pantry was gone except a jar of peanut butter and a loaf of stale bread. This was not a fancy bread pudding with cream and eggs. This was survival dessert made from 2 ingredients that never spoiled and were cheap enough for even the poorest families to afford. Peanut butter cost 23 cents per pound in 1935. A loaf of day-old bread cost 5 cents. Together they made a dessert that fed 8 people for under 30 cents. You tore 8 slices of stale bread into chunks and placed them in a greased baking dish. You heated 2 cups of whole milk in a saucepan until it steamed. You stirred half a cup of peanut butter into the hot milk and whisked until it melted completely into a creamy, tan liquid. You added half a cup of sugar and 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract to the peanut butter milk. You poured this mixture over the bread chunks and pressed down with a spoon so every piece absorbed liquid. You let it sit for 10 minutes so the bread softened completely. You baked it at 350 degrees for 45 minutes until the top turned golden brown and slightly crispy. Cornmeal dropped dumplings in broth were the Depression-era trick that turned thin, watery soup into something substantial enough to call dinner. When families could not afford meat for soup and vegetables were out of season, mothers made broth from bouillon cubes, salt, and water. The broth alone was not filling, but dropping cornmeal dumplings into the simmering liquid transformed it into a complete meal that filled stomachs for pennies. Cornmeal cost 6 cents per pound in 1935. 1 cup of cornmeal made 20 dumplings. The dumplings were the meal hiding inside the soup. You mixed 1 cup of cornmeal with half a teaspoon of salt and enough cold water to form a thick, sticky dough. The consistency was somewhere between biscuit dough and pancake batter. You brought 4 cups of chicken or vegetable broth to a rolling boil in a large pot. You used 2 spoons to scoop small portions of cornmeal dough and drop them directly into the boiling broth. The dumplings sank to the bottom immediately. You covered the pot and reduced the heat to medium. The dumplings simmered for 15 minutes without lifting the lid. During that time, they absorbed liquid and expanded to twice their original size. When you removed the lid, the dumplings had floated to the surface, puffed and golden. They looked like little sponges bobbing in the broth. The cornmeal had cooked through completely and turned soft and tender. Vinegar pie was the Depression-era dessert that replaced lemons when citrus was too expensive or completely unavailable. The recipe did not originate during the Depression. It appeared in American cookbooks as early as 1859, but it came roaring back during the 1930s when families needed tart, acidic desserts, but could not afford fresh fruit. A bottle of white vinegar cost 8 cents in 1935. A single lemon cost 12 cents. The math was simple. Vinegar was cheaper. Desperation made people creative. The recipe was pure chemistry disguised as pie. You whisked together half a cup of white vinegar, 1½ cups of hot water, 1 cup of sugar, 3 tablespoons of flour, 2 beaten eggs, 1 tablespoon of butter, and a pinch of nutmeg in a saucepan. You stirred constantly over medium heat until the mixture thickened into a custard that coated the back of a spoon. You poured the hot custard into a pre-baked pie shell. The pie cooled at room temperature for 2 hours, then went into the ice box overnight to set completely. What came out the next day looked exactly like a lemon meringue pie without the meringue. The filling was smooth, pale yellow, and sliced clean. The first bite tasted shockingly similar to lemon custard. The vinegar provided sharp acidity that made your mouth pucker. The sugar balanced the sourness. The eggs created a creamy, rich texture. Hot water dissolved the sugar completely before the cold acid hit, which prevented the eggs from scrambling and created a silky, smooth custard. That technique was passed down by watching, not reading. Vinegar pie cost 29 cents to make in 1935 compared to 78 cents for a real lemon pie. That savings mattered desperately during the Depression. The recipe disappeared after World War II when lemons became affordable again. Nobody makes vinegar pie anymore. The combination sounds disgusting to modern bakers. But during the Depression, it was the dessert that proved poverty could still taste like celebration. Canned tomato sandwiches were the summer lunch poor families made when fresh tomatoes were out of season or too expensive to buy. A 14-ounce can of whole tomatoes cost 11 cents in 1950. One can made 4 sandwiches. The canned tomatoes were pale, mushy, and tasted nothing like fresh tomatoes, but they were better than no tomatoes at all. This was the sandwich of people who could not afford deli meat, could not afford cheese, and could barely afford bread. But somehow it still tasted good. You opened a can of whole peeled tomatoes and drained most of the liquid into the sink. You sliced the tomatoes into thick rounds even though they fell apart under the knife. You spread mayonnaise thickly on 2 slices of white bread. You laid the tomato slices on 1 piece of bread, overlapping them to cover the entire surface. You sprinkled salt and black pepper generously over the tomatoes. Some families added a pinch of sugar to balance the acidity. You pressed the second slice of bread on top and cut the sandwich diagonally. You ate it immediately before the tomato juice soaked through the bread and made everything fall apart. The sandwich was cold, slippery, and messy. The juice dripped down your hands. The bread got soggy within minutes. But the combination of creamy mayonnaise, acidic tomatoes, and salty seasoning created a flavor that was greater than the sum of its cheap parts. The mayonnaise provided fat and richness. The tomatoes provided acidity and moisture. The salt and pepper made everything taste more intense. Canned tomato sandwiches were never fancy. They were never Instagram-worthy. They were the lunch of people who had almost nothing but still wanted to eat something that tasted fresh and summery. Mothers packed them in lunch pails for children going to school. Factory workers ate them standing at machines during 15-minute breaks. The sandwiches cost 19 cents to make in 1955, including the bread, mayonnaise, and tomatoes. They provided minimal nutrition, but maximum satisfaction. The sandwich was nostalgia food for anyone who grew up poor in the South. It represented making do with what you had. It proved that even canned tomatoes from the dollar store could be transformed into something worth eating if you added enough mayonnaise and salt. Canned tomato sandwiches disappeared when people could afford fresh produce year-round. Today, nobody makes them. The combination sounds gross to people who never had to eat them, but during the lean years between 1930 and 1980, canned tomato sandwiches were the taste of summer for families who could not afford the real thing. Hot dog fried rice was the 1980s poverty dinner that turned yesterday's leftover rice and a package of hot dogs into something that tasted like a real meal. This recipe did not come from China or any Asian tradition. It was invented by broke Americans who had watched enough Chinese takeout being made to understand that fried rice was just leftover rice stir fried in a hot pan with whatever protein and vegetables you had. Hot dogs were the cheapest protein at the grocery store in 1985. A package of 8 hot dogs cost 99 cents. A pot of cooked rice cost 23 cents. Together they made dinner for 4 people for under $1.50 total. You heated 2 tablespoons of vegetable oil in a large skillet or wok over high heat. You sliced 4 hot dogs into coins and fried them until they developed crispy edges and released their fat into the oil. You pushed the hot dogs to the side of the pan. You cracked 2 eggs into the hot oil and scrambled them quickly into small curds. You added 4 cups of cold leftover rice to the pan. Cold rice was essential because freshly cooked rice turned mushy when fried. The cold grains stayed separate and fried up into individual pearls. You stirred everything together, breaking up clumps of rice with a spatula. You added 3 tablespoons of soy sauce and kept stirring over high heat for 5 minutes until the rice turned golden brown in spots. Some families added frozen mixed vegetables. Some added a dash of sesame oil. Most just made it with hot dogs, eggs, rice, and soy sauce because that was what they could afford. The fried rice came out hot, salty, and surprisingly satisfying. The hot dogs provided smoky, meaty flavor. The eggs added richness. The soy sauce made everything taste savory and complex. Each grain of rice was coated in oil and browned slightly from the high heat. The dish tasted like Chinese takeout even though it cost 90% less. Kids ate it without complaining. Adults felt like they had cooked something real instead of just surviving. Hot dog fried rice became the signature meal of broke families in the 1980s and 1990s. Single mothers made it 3 times a week. College students made it in dorm rooms using hot plates. It was the dinner you made when paychecks did not stretch far enough and takeout was unaffordable. The recipe still works today. Hot dog fried rice costs under $3 to feed 4 people. It proves that poverty cooking is not dead. It just evolved. 30 poverty dinners disappeared in 1 generation. Every single one was cooked by mothers who stretched pennies into full meals. Every single one fed families through the Depression, recessions, and hard times when paychecks ran short. The recipes were never written in fancy cookbooks. They were passed down by watching grandmothers cook in silent kitchens where shame and survival lived side by side. These dinners were not about taste. They were about making it through another week without going hungry. They were about feeding 6 people on $2. They were about turning nothing into something and calling it dinner without apologizing. Mothers cooked hamburger gravy over toast at midnight after double shifts. Grandmothers fried oatmeal patties from yesterday's breakfast because wasting food was unthinkable. Fathers made poor man's meal with hot dogs and potatoes because it was all they knew how to cook. These meals kept families alive when the economy collapsed, when jobs disappeared, when hope ran out, but hunger did not. Then, the hard times ended. Grocery stores filled with choices. Frozen dinners replaced cast-iron skillets. Comment which dinner you remember. Share this with someone who grew up poor. Before these recipes disappear completely. Before nobody remembers that poverty once had a taste.